The text arrived at 11:51 at night. It was from my father. "We have finalized the agreement. You are no longer a part of this family." A second later, my older brother Nicholas sent a mocking heart icon. In a single millisecond, every ounce of hope I had clung to shattered into dust. Have you ever been deeply hurt by your own flesh and blood? Share your story in the comments below. I want to know who is here with me right now. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp, and I certainly didn't pick up my phone to ask why. I walked across the room, shut my door until the latch clicked into place, and walked over to my desk. I opened my laptop. The cold blue light washed over my face, illuminating the silent room. Anger wasn't loud this time. It wasn't a screaming, burning sensation in my chest. It was clinical. It was precise. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon some ghost of regret. But there was only absolute, crystal clear clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I glanced at the clock on my wall. The time was exactly 11:52 at night. By 12:03 in the morning, my retaliation would be complete. I am a military data analyst. I deal in threat assessments, system vulnerabilities, and strategic neutralization. For years, I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, funding their extravagant lives from behind a secure firewall. They viewed my love as a business contract, and I had been blindly footing the bill. Now, I realized that my loyalty was merely a subscription service they took for granted. I logged into my primary banking portal. My keystrokes were methodical, carrying absolutely no hesitation. First, I located the secondary credit cards I had issued to Nicholas. He used them to fund his lavish weekends, buying expensive drinks to impress people who didn't care about him. I highlighted the accounts and clicked cancel. The screen refreshed, confirming the termination. Next, I moved to the automated transfers. Every single month, a substantial portion of my salary was routed to an account controlled by my father, Richard. That money paid the mortgage on the sprawling house he lived in, the very house he had just banished me from. I deleted the routing instructions. The automated payment scheduled for the next morning was instantly voided. Finally, I accessed the shared emergency fund I had established to cover the property taxes and maintenance for our so-called family estate. I transferred the entire balance back into my private sole ownership account. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a warning message. I didn't owe them an explanation for stopping my own financial bleeding. They weren't going to be shocked by what they had done to me. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. They had severed the emotional ties, so I was simply severing the financial ones. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, and for the first time in 28 years, I felt completely in control. I sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside my window. The transaction was over. My father and brother had assumed I would respond with desperate pleas for reconciliation. They believed my need for their validation would override my self-respect. They had severely miscalculated. I had spent my entire adult life analyzing data to predict enemy movements, yet I had ignored the parasites living in my own bloodline. The emotional drain had been stopped, the leaks had been plugged, and my assets were finally secure. As I sat in the quiet of my room, I forced myself to review the history of my silent sacrifices. It was important to document the past to justify the present. For almost a decade, I had been the financial backbone of a family that treated me like an outsider. When Nicholas racked up $75,000 in underground gambling debts, I was the one who liquidated my early investments to keep his legs from being broken. When Richard received the notice that the heritage land, the sprawling estate that had been in our family for 3 generations, was about to be seized for unpaid taxes, I was the one who took on a second contract job to clear the $50,000 lien. I had paid their debts, funded their mistakes, and subsidized their arrogance without a single word of complaint. Why did I endure it for so long? People outside the situation might look at my actions and call it foolishness. Psychologists might call it trauma bonding, but in reality, it is the invisible chain of the survivor. This chain is forged in childhood, hammered out of guilt, expectation, and the desperate lingering hope that you might one day be deemed worthy of love. You convince yourself that enduring the pain is the price of admission for a family. You stay not because you are weak, but because you have weaponized your own endurance. You mistakenly believe that your silent, persistent suffering will eventually purchase their respect. You treat your sacrifices like deposits in an emotional bank account, waiting for a return on investment that will never, ever materialize. But it never does. It just trains them to exploit you more efficiently. The invisible chain of the survivor binds you to the very people who are draining you dry, making you feel responsible for their survival while they completely disregard yours. I had treated my endurance as a long-term investment strategy. Every time I cleared Nicholas's reckless debts, I thought I was purchasing my father's temporary approval. Every time I paid the exorbitant land taxes, I viewed it as a premium I had to pay to avoid complete isolation. I had turned my compliance into a purposeful patience, meticulously mapping out their exact financial dependencies on me. I kept detailed spreadsheets of every transfer, every bailout, and every emergency rescue. Crucially, I had also required them to sign digital promissory notes for every significant loan, treating our family finances like a professional business arrangement. I didn't do it out of malice at the time. I did it because data was my only comfort. It was the only way I could quantify my worth to them. But the data had eventually revealed a devastating truth. My worth to Richard and Nicholas was exactly equal to the dollar amount I could provide. They didn't love Elena the daughter or Elena the sister. They loved Elena the endless credit line. My silence wasn't a sign of submission. It had been a period of observation. I had learned their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and their complete inability to sustain their own lives. By cutting them off, I wasn't just stopping the payments. I was shattering the invisible chain and stepping out of the survivor's prison. The retaliation came exactly as expected. The next morning, Richard and Nicholas called me to issue direct, aggressive threats. When I answered the phone, Richard's voice was distorted with pure rage. He screamed that I was an ungrateful traitor, a malicious daughter who was trying to intentionally ruin her own family. He demanded that I restore his access to my finances immediately or face severe consequences. Nicholas chimed in on the call, his tone devoid of the mocking attitude he had displayed the night before. Instead, he promised to make my life a living hell if I didn't reverse the account cancellations. As I had calculated, they weren't showing a single ounce of remorse for discarding me. They felt absolutely no guilt for explicitly telling me I was no longer a part of the family. They were entirely consumed by the sheer shock that I had actually stopped playing along and permanently revoked their access to my money. The long-standing illusion of their superiority was crumbling rapidly, and their response was pure, unadulterated venom. When direct intimidation failed to yield an immediate financial deposit, they escalated their tactics. They began actively spreading a fabricated, highly damaging story across our entire social circle. They deliberately spread false rumors that I had maliciously stolen money from the family. They told everyone that I was a deceitful thief, completely twisting my years of silent financial support into a bizarre, baseless embezzlement narrative. The level of their cruelty had exponentially increased. They had moved far past simple emotional dismissal and were now actively attempting to completely destroy my personal and professional reputation. They wanted to force me into a desperate corner where I had no choice but to use the law to defend myself. I didn't panic, and I didn't rush to beg for their mercy. I sat at my desk and analyzed their latest threat with the cold, precise detachment of a military data analyst. By launching a deliberate smear campaign that falsely accused me of financial crimes, they had taken a private, toxic family dynamic and recklessly dragged it into the public arena. They had foolishly turned an emotional dispute into a documentable, actionable war. They had handed me the exact, undeniable justification I needed to respond with overwhelming legal force. I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire operation and make sure they paid heavily for every single lie they had manufactured against me. They arrogantly thought they were dealing with a frightened, submissive girl, but they had just declared a full-scale war on a data analyst equipped with an impeccable memory and flawless record-keeping. Every word they spoke during that threatening phone call, every malicious rumor they planted, was just another piece of data I catalogued for my impending strike. They failed to realize that their escalating cruelty was only solidifying my absolute resolve. They were digging their own graves with every false accusation they whispered. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I needed representation. I found Sarah, an incredibly tough, uncompromising lawyer with a ruthless reputation. I secured a consultation and walked into her office with my head held high. I didn't waste her time with emotional backstories. Instead, I explained the situation using purely transactional and legal terms. Sarah and I immediately began working together. We meticulously drafted a formal, official legal notice. We weren't just demanding a retraction of their defamatory rumors. We were officially recalling all the debts. Every dollar I had lent Nicholas to cover his expenses, every massive land tax payment I had made for Richard, all of it had been carefully documented. We demanded complete financial transparency and the immediate repayment of everything they owed me. The family war was no longer a messy, emotional dispute. It had been officially transformed into a professional legal file. It was no longer about hurt feelings, betrayal, or seeking apologies. It was strictly about contracts, liabilities, and absolute financial compliance. When the formal notice was drafted and prepared for delivery, the entire power dynamic of our relationship shifted permanently. I was no longer the discarded, unappreciated daughter desperately seeking their love. I was a formidable creditor, and I was calling in their markers. I had weaponized my meticulous records, and they were wholly unprepared for a war fought entirely through legal channels. They had assumed my silence meant weakness, but they were about to discover that my silence had simply been preparation. Sarah reviewed the final draft of the official notice one last time before sending it out. She looked up at me and nodded, acknowledging the sheer volume of indisputable facts we had compiled. There was no room for interpretation, no margin for their usual emotional manipulation. They were trapped by their own greed and financial mismanagement. As I left Sarah's office, the anxiety that had plagued me for years was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, clinical focus. They had chosen to discard me, but I was the one who held the keys to their financial survival. The legal demands had been set, and the professional escalation was complete. Every specific detail in that formal notice was designed to strip away their false authority. We made it unequivocally clear that failure to provide complete financial transparency would result in severe, uncompromising legal action. Sarah's expertise ensured that the language we used was cold, objective, and legally binding. We stripped the situation of any familial context. In the eyes of the law, Richard and Nicholas were merely delinquent debtors who had defaulted on their obligations. I had spent my entire life trying to appeal to their sense of family, but now I was exclusively communicating through an aggressive legal framework. This professional escalation was my definitive declaration of independence. I was actively setting the terms of our engagement, refusing to play their toxic emotional games any longer. The transition from a dysfunctional family dynamic to a structured professional legal file was the most empowering decision I had ever made. They had wanted to treat my support as a business transaction they could simply terminate, so I was finalizing the paperwork to close out their accounts for good. 3 days later, Sarah called me. Her tone was sharp and urgent. Richard hadn't just ignored our notice, he had filed a lawsuit against me. However, Richard's arrogance had vastly outpaced his intelligence. Sarah informed me that she had reviewed the legal file Richard submitted to the court to sue me, and she had discovered a lethal flaw. The documents he submitted actually contained forged signatures. He had desperately falsified the paperwork, forging my signature. It was a sloppy, desperate move, and it constituted a fatal, critical blow to his entire case. But Sarah didn't stop there. Digging deeper, she uncovered the ultimate betrayal. She found concrete evidence that Richard had secretly placed an illegal, high-interest lien on our heritage land with black market creditors, effectively jeopardizing our family legacy to fund Nicholas's lifestyle. My father had sold our history to save my brother's worthless skin. This is the ultimate illusion of power from an empty wallet. People who build their entire identity and self-worth on inherited status rather than earned value live in a constant, fragile state of cognitive dissonance. Their perceived superiority is just a rented facade, funded entirely by someone else. When the money finally stops flowing, they don't adapt, and they don't learn humility. They simply self-destruct. Because their fragile egos cannot survive the crushing reality of their own incompetence, they resort to blatant criminality. They convince themselves that the rules don't apply to them, that their bloodline entitles them to take whatever they want. Richard and Nicholas hadn't just betrayed me on a personal level, they had actively committed fraud and forgery. They were drowning in an ocean of their own making, and they had tried to use my forged name as a stolen life preserver. As Sarah laid out the evidence before me, any lingering trace of familial loyalty evaporated into the cold air. They were no longer my father and brother. They were criminals, and I was going to let the justice system crush them. The sheer audacity of their actions was almost difficult to comprehend, but the evidence didn't lie. The forged signatures on the court documents and the secret sale of the heritage land to dangerous black market creditors proved that they were completely morally bankrupt. Their empty wallets had finally exposed the complete corruption of their characters. This criminal twist completely annihilated any chance of them ever rehabilitating themselves. Their capacity for redemption was entirely non-existent. They had deliberately chosen to cross the line into undeniable criminality just to maintain their pathetic illusion of wealth and control. Sarah meticulously documented every forged signature and every illegal land transfer, preparing a flawless counterstrike that would leave them with absolutely no route of escape. We were no longer just seeking repayment. We were preparing to deliver a devastating legal reckoning. The fateful discovery of their criminal activities marked the exact moment their entire fraudulent empire began its final, inevitable collapse. I absorbed this information without shedding a single tear. My analytical mind processed their federal offenses not as a family tragedy, but as a crucial data point that guaranteed our total victory. They had foolishly engineered their own absolute destruction, and I was fully prepared to watch the law execute the final judgment. The courtroom was cold, quiet, and impeccably sterile. It was the perfect, emotionless environment for the execution of justice. The heavy oak doors and polished marble floors stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, messy lies my family had spun. Judge Samuel presided over the hearing. He was a commanding man with over 60 years of life experience, an imposing legal mind, and absolutely zero tolerance for perjury. As I sat beside Sarah at the plaintiff's table, I felt a deep, unwavering calm. I wore a tailored black suit, my posture rigid, my expression unreadable. Richard and Nicholas sat at the defense table across the aisle. They looked haggard and panicked. Their usual arrogance was melting rapidly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The illusion of their superiority had been stripped away, leaving behind two desperate men facing the terrifying reality of their actions. Sarah stood and methodically presented the evidence to Judge Samuel. She didn't raise her voice or use theatrical gestures. She simply let the data speak. She presented the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the time-stamped bank logs, and the indisputable property records proving the illegal sale of the heritage land to black market creditors. She laid out the timeline of my tax payments, demonstrating how Richard had knowingly defrauded me out of tens of thousands of dollars for property he had already secretly liquidated. Judge Samuel's face darkened as he reviewed the documents. He didn't just rule against them. He systematically dismantled their entire existence. His voice boomed through the courtroom as he exposed Richard's crimes for the public record, his words cutting through their lies like a scalpel. He declared the counter-lawsuit fraudulent and referred the forged documents to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. He issued an immediate preliminary injunction against their assets to prevent further dissipation, pending a final, comprehensive liquidation order. Furthermore, Judge Samuel ordered their immediate eviction from the remaining family property, mandating a total liquidation of all their remaining assets to repay the black market creditors, and, most importantly, to execute full restitution to me. He addressed Richard directly, condemning his actions as a gross violation of both the law and basic human decency. The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack that echoed off the high ceiling, sealing their fate. As the bailiffs moved in to escort them out of the courtroom, Richard turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg or hurl one final insult, but the bailiff placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Nicholas looked like he was going to be sick. They were escorted out through the heavy wooden doors, their reputations destroyed, utterly bankrupt, completely humiliated, and facing severe criminal charges that would likely result in prison time. I stood up slowly, calmly adjusting the lapels of my jacket. I watched them go, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing for them. There was no pity, no malice, and no residual anger. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a perfectly closed account. It wasn't that I lacked the capacity for pain. It was that I had finally exhausted my supply of it for people who never deserved my tears. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face. The heavy burden I had carried for 28 years was finally lifted. I had entered that building as a victim of their endless exploitation, but I walked out as a victorious survivor who had fought back with undeniable facts. There are two distinct types of justice in this world. There is the justice of the executioner, which focuses only on destroying the past, tearing down the structures of those who have wronged you. And then there is the justice of the planter, which clears the toxic, poisoned soil in order to grow something entirely new. I didn't just burn their corrupt empire to the ground. I reclaimed my stolen resources, my time and my energy to build my own unshakable foundation. True justice isn't merely about watching the guilty fall into ruin. It is about establishing boundaries so strong that they can never steal your harvest again. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always a gift you give to the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It means accepting that the past cannot be changed, while fiercely and unapologetically protecting your future. The wounds they inflicted will always be part of my history, but they no longer dictate my trajectory. I am no longer the girl seeking approval in a house of mirrors, desperately trying to prove my worth to people incapable of seeing it. I am the architect of my own life, standing firm on ground that I secured with my own strength. Justice has finally been served. If you believe that everyone must take responsibility for their own actions, hit the like button and share this video to support justice.